You know, it's funny how just a simple conversation can really change the way you think about something. I was in Dallas once talking to a reporter, and I kind of offhandedly mentioned that I wouldn't have guessed Texas had a big Jewish population.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And she
What?
turns out I was, well, wrong.
Yeah.
And it got me thinking about all the unexpected twists and turns in history, things you wouldn't expect.
Yeah.
So today, we're diving into one of those, the connection between Texas and the early Zionist movement.
Okay.
We've got a historical podcast episode and Rachel Pockrell's book, Melting Point, to guide us. So should we jump right in?
Let's do it. What's interesting, I think, is that when most people think about Zionism, they immediately think about Israel, the creation of Israel.
Right.
But the journey to a Jewish homeland, well, it wasn't always so straightforward. It wasn't like, okay, Palestine, that's it.
Oh, I see.
The early 20th century, that's when you see all these explorations, these almost like detours, before the focus really locked in on Palestine.
Like trying to figure out where to go, where to even start.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, well, let's start with the man who really got things moving.
Yeah.
Theodor Herzl, this charismatic journalist from Vienna. He was a leading figure in the Zionist movement back in the late 1800s. Almost a rock star, actually.
Oh, wow.
He wrote about finding a promised land, a place where Jewish people could escape persecution, build new lives, really flourish. And initially, he had Palestine in mind.
Right, yeah. His ideas, they really resonated with a lot of people, especially during a time when anti-Semitism was a huge problem. Especially in Eastern Europe. But it's important to remember that Zionism, it wasn't just one single idea.
Right. It was a movement, a whole ideology.
Exactly. For some, it was all about a divine calling, returning to their biblical homeland. But others saw it more as a political necessity, a solution to the threats they were facing.
Oh, that makes sense. So there were different interpretations within the movement itself.
Yeah, and that internal debate about the meaning of Zionism, well, that would really shape the direction of the movement moving forward.
Okay, so how does Texas fit into all of this?
Well, things in Europe, they were getting worse. The pogroms in Russia, just awful.
Yeah.
Herzl knew they needed a safe place, and fast. He even reached out to the British government, hoping they could offer some temporary refuge for Jewish people.
And they suggested Uganda. I read that somewhere.
You're right. It's hard to imagine now, but at the time, the British Empire, well, they had their hands in a lot of places, and they saw Uganda as a potential solution.
It makes sense. They had colonial interests in East Africa.
Exactly. They probably thought it could address both Jewish needs and their own strategic goals.
Two birds with one stone.
Right.
Did Herzl seriously consider it?
He did, out of desperation, really. They needed a safe haven. But ultimately, the idea of a Jewish homeland in Uganda, it just didn't sit right with most Zionists.
Well,
culturally, historically, it was too far removed from Palestine.
the heart wasn't in it.
Exactly.
So the search for a promised land continued. What was the next step?
So this is where Israel Zangwill comes in. This prominent English Jewish writer, sharp wit, incredibly smart.
I actually read somewhere that he was once called the ugliest man in the world by a newspaper.
You're kidding? Well, he must have had some serious charm to make up for it.
I guess so.
He initially supported Herzl, but eventually went his own way, formed the Jewish Territorial Organization, the JTO.
Oh, JTO.
Their motto was, if we cannot get the Holy Land, we can make another land holy.
I love that. It's so practical.
Totally. They were open to creating a Jewish homeland basically anywhere.
Wow. So where do they look?
Everywhere. Australia, Canada, even parts of Africa again. Zangwill was particularly interested in the United States. It was already a popular destination for Jewish immigrants.
Makes sense.
He even had this, well, let's call it audacious, idea of buying an entire southern state.
Wait, really? To create a Jewish homeland right here in America?
Yeah.
Can you imagine the government's reaction to that?
Oh, I can only imagine.
So, how did Texas end up on their radar?
Well, some prominent American Jewish figures were getting worried. They saw this growing concentration of Jewish immigrants in New York City, in the Lower East Side.
Yeah.
They were afraid it would fuel anti-Semitism.
Right, if they were all concentrated in one place.
Exactly. They wanted people to spread out more. So they were thinking, okay, let's create a new entry point for Jewish immigrants.
A place that would encourage them to settle elsewhere.
You got it. And that brings us to Galveston, Texas.
Galveston.
Remember, Galveston was still recovering from that awful hurricane in 1900.
Right.
They were rebuilding, and let's be honest, it wasn't exactly a place that would make you want to stay put.
So you're saying its unattractiveness actually made it ideal.
Exactly.
That's fascinating. So what did they want to do with Galveston?
The Galveston Plan, that's what they called it.
Okay.
And it was ambitious, to say the least. They wanted to turn Galveston into the Ellis Island of the West.
Wow.
Their goal was to resettle, get this, up to 2 million Jewish immigrants across the American West.
2 million. That's unbelievable.
Right. Zangwill even joked, called Texas Palestine USA.
He had quite a sense of humor.
He did. So, did they reach that goal of 2 million?
I'm going to guess no.
Yeah, you're right. The First World War, that really messed things up. It disrupted everything. But even though they didn't hit that initial target, the Galveston Plan still brought over 10,000 Jewish immigrants to Texas.
Between 1907 and 1914.
That's right. And that had a huge impact on Texas, on the demographics, on the culture. It's really remarkable.
I mean, it's incredible to think about how this plan, which started as a desperate search for refuge, ended up creating a whole new chapter in Jewish American history. And right here in Texas.
Isn't that something? It just shows you how these seemingly random events can come together and have these huge ripple effects. The hurricane in Galveston, the need to find a safe place for Jewish people, this idea of spreading out across the West, all these things came together to create this unique moment in history.
It really is fascinating. It makes you think about those 10,000 immigrants who came through Galveston. What were their lives like once they got to Texas? I mean, it must have been so different from what they were used to in Europe.
Oh, absolutely. Texas back then, it was still very much a frontier, mostly rural, you know?
Right.
A lot of these immigrants, they ended up in smaller towns, not the big cities they might have known.
So how did they adapt? It must have been a huge adjustment.
They were resilient. I mean, think about it. They brought their skills, their traditions, and they used them to carve out a new life.
That's amazing.
Many of them became merchants, peddlers, shopkeepers, filled a need in these growing communities.
Makes sense.
Others, they turned to farming.
Oh, wow.
There are these really interesting stories about Jewish farmers in Texas using their knowledge from Europe to grow crops in this completely new environment.
I never would have pictured that.
Yeah.
Jewish farmers in Texas.
Right.
It's inspiring, taking on those challenges and making it work. But I have to ask, did they face any specific problems being Jewish immigrants in a mostly Christian state?
I mean, there were definitely challenges. They faced prejudice, discrimination. Anti-Semitism was, unfortunately, pretty common back then.
Right.
But there were also people who were welcoming. There are stories of Jewish merchants forming close relationships with their non-Jewish neighbors, communities coming together to celebrate each other's traditions.
It's like this mix of hardship and hope,
Yeah.
a classic immigrant experience. Were they able to hold on to their Jewish identity while becoming part of Texan society?
That's a really good question, and it ties into this whole melting pot idea that was so big at the time.
Right, the idea that immigrants should just blend in, become American?
Exactly. And while many did adapt to American ways, they also found ways to keep their Jewish heritage alive.
I mean,
Synagogues started popping up all over Texas. They became these centers for the community, a place to connect with their faith, and they kept their cultural traditions going, passing them down to their kids.
it's amazing how they managed to do both. It's interesting that this melting pot idea really took off around the same time as the Galveston Plan. I'm thinking of Israel Zangwill's play, The Melting Pot. It premiered in 1908, right?
1908, yeah. And it really captured the mood of the time.
It did.
And, Zangwill, he wasn't just an observer. He was deeply involved in Jewish immigration, both intellectually and practically. His play, it tells a story of a Russian Jewish immigrant who falls in love with a Russian Christian immigrant.
Oh, wow.
It's this hopeful vision of a future where differences fade away and everyone becomes American. And get this, President Theodore Roosevelt, he saw the play.
Really?
Yeah, and he loved it. He became a big supporter of this melting pot idea for America.
He was all about assimilation, wasn't he? Believed immigrants should prioritize being American above everything else.
He did. And his views, well, they reflect this bigger debate that was happening then, and honestly, it's still going on today. Should immigrants be encouraged to fit in, or should they be able to keep their own cultures? It's complicated.
It is. There are no easy answers. I wonder how the Galveston Plan would have played into this. Let's say it had worked and they brought those 2 million Jewish immigrants to Texas.
Yeah.
Would they have felt even more pressure to assimilate? Or would their numbers have given them the strength to hold on to their traditions more openly?
It's interesting to think about. On the one hand, with so many of them, they could have built a stronger sense of identity, you know? They could have resisted that pressure to assimilate, created these thriving Jewish communities that would have changed the West completely.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, such a large presence, it might have caused a backlash, led to more anti-Semitism, pushed people even harder to conform.
It's a real what-if scenario. And it
Yeah.
makes you think about how complex immigration is, how it changes cultures. It also shows how even the best plans can have unexpected outcomes. It really shows you how just one event, like that hurricane in Galveston, can trigger all these other events, events that have an impact for years and years. I mean, it even shaped the lives of thousands of people.
It's true. And those 10,000 Jewish immigrants, they weren't just looking for a safe place. They brought so much with them, their culture, their traditions, their skills, and they really left their mark on Texas.
Absolutely. I mean, even just thinking about the economic impact, we often
Yeah.
talk about how immigrants contribute to the workforce, but they also bring this entrepreneurial spirit, these unique talents.
Mhm.
Did they establish any particular industries or businesses that became connected to Jewish communities in Texas?
Oh, for sure. I mean, some of them became really successful merchants. They built these department store and trading networks that helped their communities grow economically.
Wow.
And others, they focused on specific trades, like tailoring or shoemaking.
Oh, interesting.
Their craftsmanship, it became known all over the region.
So they weren't just fitting into existing systems, they were actually shaping the economy. That's an important point. Did that economic success help them gain more social acceptance? Or did they still face prejudice, even though they were contributing so much?
It's tough to say. I mean, sometimes economic success did lead to more acceptance, but it didn't completely erase the prejudice. There are stories about Jewish businessmen who were really wealthy, but they were still excluded from certain social circles.
Right.
So it really depended on the specific community, the specific people involved. It's a complicated issue.
It always is, isn't it? It reminds us that history is never black and white. Progress isn't always a straight line. Did this constant back and forth between assimilating and holding on to their Jewish identity, did that have a lasting impact on the communities they built in Texas?
Oh, definitely. You can see the legacy of that struggle even today. Some communities, they chose to integrate more, while others held on tight to their traditional Jewish practices and culture. And this variety of experiences, that's what makes the history of Jewish Texans so interesting.
It wasn't just one single story.
Right, exactly. It was a bunch of different stories, all woven together, a tapestry.
This deep dive has really opened my eyes to a part of American history that I knew almost nothing about. I bet most of our listeners are probably feeling the same way. It's incredible to think that a city in Texas became part of this global movement, Zionism, even if it was just for a while.
Yeah. And it makes you think about this idea of searching for a promised land, a place where you belong, where you have opportunities.
Right.
For some, that was Palestine, but for others, it was America. It was Texas.
What I find so inspiring is the resilience of these immigrants. I mean, think about what they went through, a new language, a new culture, and so much prejudice. Yet they found a way to build communities, to leave their mark on Texas.
It's a real testament to the human spirit, to that desire for a better life, and to the power of community when times are tough.
I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about today. The complexities of immigration, how identity changes, and just how unpredictable history can be. I mean, what if the Galveston Plan had really worked? What if 2 million Jewish immigrants had come to the West? How different would America be today?
Wow, now that's a question. Just imagine the cultural shifts, the economic changes, the political impact. It really makes you realize that history is all about choices and circumstances. And even something small can have massive consequences.
It makes you wonder about all the untold stories that shape our world, doesn't it? I hope this deep dive has sparked some curiosity in you, the listener. I hope it makes you want to explore those hidden parts of history and to think about how they still affect us today.